Within hours of the very first strikes of this war, Iran's Revolutionary Guard put out a claim that would end up repeating itself in one form or another at least 5 separate times over the following month. The USS Abraham Lincoln, one of the largest warships on the planet, had been hit, disabled, sunk, or forced to flee, depending on which specific Iranian statement you happened to read that week. Every single time the United States said the exact same thing in response. None of it happened, backed by named officials, released footage, and a strike record that held up to independent scrutiny every single time it was checked. And let's walk through exactly what Iran actually claimed, exactly what the American military said in return, and exactly what real naval losses were actually taking place at the same time. Because the true story here is genuinely more significant than any single fabricated claim about a sunken aircraft carrier. It's just a very different story than the one Iranian state media was telling, and it's one that deserves to be understood in full rather than reduced to a single viral headline. If you want the accurate, fact-checked account of what actually happened at sea during this war, stick with this one all the way through. If it's useful, go ahead and subscribe. Drop a comment with your take once we get through it, and let's get into it. It's worth being upfront about the shape of this story before diving into the details, because it genuinely runs in the opposite direction from what the title alone might suggest. This isn't a story about the United States narrowly avoiding disaster at sea, or about a close call that got walked back through clever messaging. It's a story about a sustained, repeatedly debunked propaganda campaign running in parallel with a real, devastating, independently verified naval defeat, and understanding why those two things happened at exactly the same time tells you a great deal about how modern wartime information campaigns actually operate under pressure. Let's start right at the beginning, because the very first hours of this war set the pattern for almost everything that followed. Operation Epic Fury, the joint American and Israeli campaign against Iran, began on February 28, 2026. Within hours of those opening strikes, U.S. Central Command confirmed that American forces had struck the Iranian drone carrier IRIS Shahid Bagheri in the Persian Gulf, describing critical damage to the vessel and reporting that it appeared to be sinking. That ship wasn't some minor patrol boat either. The Shahid Bagheri was Iran's first dedicated drone carrier, a converted commercial container vessel originally built by South Korea's Hyundai Heavy Industries, rebuilt between 2022 and 2024 at an Iranian shipyard near Bandar Abbas, and formally commissioned into Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy service in February of 2025, barely a year before it came under fire. At nearly 42,000 tons, with an angled flight deck stretching roughly 180 meters and a ski jump ramp specifically designed to help launch drones, it represented Iran's most ambitious attempt yet to project naval power and drone warfare capability far beyond its own coastline, capable of carrying dozens of unmanned aerial vehicles alongside helicopters and fast attack craft. According to reporting on the vessel's capabilities, it could carry up to 60 different drones, ranging from Mohajer-6 armed UAVs to Shahed, 136 loitering munitions, along with internal storage for roughly 30 fast attack boats that could be launched through side openings for exactly the kind of swarm and hit and run tactics Iran has relied on throughout this entire conflict. In other words, this wasn't a symbolic target. It was arguably the single most significant asset in Iran's entire naval drone warfare program, and it went down within hours of the war even starting. It's worth understanding a bit more about how Iran built this specific ship in the first place, because the backstory adds real context to just how significant a loss it actually represented. The Shahid Bagheri wasn't purpose-built as a warship from the keel up. It began life as an ordinary commercial container vessel, purchased and then converted at significant expense, and over several years, specifically to give Iran's naval drone program a mobile, sea-based launch platform it had never had before. That conversion process, completed at a shipyard near Bandar Abbas between 2022 and 2024, represented a genuine strategic investment by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, an attempt to extend Iran's reach well beyond its own coastal waters, using largely improvised, cost-effective naval engineering, rather than the kind of purpose-built, multi-billion-dollar supercarriers a nation like the United States relies on. That improvised, budget-conscious approach to naval power projection is exactly why the ship's loss mattered so much operationally. Even though it lacked the raw size or symbolic weight of an actual American aircraft carrier, it represented years of patient investment in exactly the kind of asymmetric naval capability Iran had been counting on to threaten shipping throughout this entire war. Iran's response to losing that ship came almost immediately, and it set the tone for the information war that would run alongside the actual shooting war for the following weeks. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed that 4 ballistic missiles had struck the USS Abraham Lincoln in the Gulf, a claim explicitly framed as retaliation for the deaths of senior Iranian officials in the opening strikes, including Iran's own supreme leader at the time, Ali Khamenei, a loss significant enough on its own to demand some kind of immediate morale-boosting response from Iran's remaining leadership. CENTCOM's response was swift and pointed, stating directly that the Iranian regime's, in its words, false messaging machine continued to falsely claim it had sunk a U.S. aircraft carrier, and clarifying plainly that the only carrier actually hit that day was the Shahid Bagheri, an Iranian drone carrier, not an American one. That exchange, real Iranian ship destroyed within hours, immediately followed by an Iranian claim of having destroyed an American ship instead, established almost exactly the pattern that would repeat itself again and again throughout the following month. It's worth understanding what the USS Abraham Lincoln actually was, and why it became such an obvious recurring target for Iranian propaganda, specifically. The Lincoln is a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered supercarrier, one of the largest and most powerful warships ever built by any navy in human history, and its carrier strike group had arrived in the Arabian Sea in early February, positioning American air power directly within reach of Iranian territory well before this war's opening strikes even happened. For a country trying to rally its own population and project strength to the wider region, in the face of a devastating opening bombardment, claiming to have struck the single most iconic symbol of American military power in the theater carries an obvious and powerful propaganda value, regardless of whether the claim holds up to any actual scrutiny. A drone carrier, however genuinely significant its loss actually was to Iran's own military capability, simply doesn't carry the same symbolic weight in a state media broadcast as claiming to have struck an American supercarrier. And that asymmetry in propaganda value helps explain why Iran kept returning to this specific claim so many separate times, even after it had been debunked repeatedly. There's a useful comparison worth drawing here to how militaries have historically handled exactly this kind of asymmetric propaganda temptation. Throughout the history of modern warfare, the side suffering heavier confirmed losses has consistently faced a stronger pull toward inflating or fabricating claims about enemy losses, precisely because the psychological and political cost of admitting sustained defeat, especially early in a conflict, can be genuinely destabilizing for a government's own domestic legitimacy. That dynamic isn't unique to Iran or to this specific war. It's a recurring feature of how nations under military pressure manage public perception. But the sheer frequency and specificity of the claims made about the Abraham Lincoln throughout this particular conflict, 5 distinct versions across less than a month, stands out even against that broader historical pattern. The pattern continued almost immediately. On March 1st, Iran's military claimed it had targeted the Abraham Lincoln with 4 ballistic missiles. CENTCOM's response, posted directly and unambiguously, read simply, "The Lincoln was not hit. The missiles launched didn't even come close," adding that the carrier continued launching aircraft in support of its ongoing campaign against Iranian targets. Just days later, on March 4th, the IRGC Navy shifted its story slightly, now claiming its naval drone units had struck the Lincoln in the Sea of Oman, forcing the carrier and its escort ships to retreat more than 1,000 kilometers from the area. A spokesperson for Iran's Qatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters told Tehran Times that the carrier had been intercepted roughly 340 kilometers from Iran's maritime border, while operating near the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. Notice already how much the story had shifted in less than a week. From ballistic missiles to drones, from a direct hit to a forced retreat, each new version of the claim adjusting to account for the fact that the previous version had already been publicly and unambiguously denied. Here's where the contrast between claim and reality becomes almost impossible to ignore, because right in the middle of this exact same window, CENTCOM was releasing actual verifiable footage of a real naval strike, just not against the ship Iran kept claiming to have hit. On March 6th, Central Command posted surveillance footage showing the Shahid Bagheri, the same drone carrier struck in the war's opening hours, being hit again, this time visibly engulfed in flames from a massive explosion in the middle of the ship. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed the strike directly in a subsequent Pentagon briefing alongside CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper, describing the vessel as ablaze, and Central Command's own social media post at the time noted, with a fairly pointed tone, that an Iranian drone carrier roughly the size of a World War II-era aircraft carrier had been struck and was now on fire, a description that reads almost like a direct rebuttal to Iran's parallel claims about the Abraham Lincoln happening at the exact same time. So in the same week, Iran was telling its own population and the wider world that it had forced an American supercarrier into a 1,000-kilometer retreat. The American military was releasing real, confirmed video of Iran's own largest naval asset burning for the second time in a single week. The timing here is genuinely worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's rare to get this clean a side-by-side comparison between a fabricated claim and documented reality happening in the same week. On one side, Iranian officials were telling state media outlets that their forces had pushed an American supercarrier 1,000 kilometers away from the coast. A dramatic, morale-boosting story with no supporting evidence of any kind. On the other side, The American military was releasing actual video, actual named officials speaking on the record. Actual confirmation from the Secretary of Defense himself, showing Iran's own most significant naval asset burning for the second time in a single week. Anyone comparing those two accounts side by side, one built entirely on unverified assertion and one built on released footage and named officials, would have had every reason to find the American version considerably more credible, and that's exactly what independent fact-checkers and defense journalists covering this specific stretch of the war ultimately concluded. The claims didn't stop there, and this is really the part of the story that turns from simple wartime propaganda into something closer to a genuine, sustained disinformation campaign. On March 8th, a video began circulating widely on social media, first posted to Instagram and then picked up and amplified across X, showing what was claimed to be a burning, sinking American aircraft carrier, with Arabic language captions urging viewers to spread the footage everywhere so the world could see what would happen to America. Within hours, versions of that video had racked up over 100,000 views and thousands of shares. Fact-checkers moved quickly to debunk it, and what they found was genuinely revealing about how this specific propaganda campaign was operating. The video wasn't real footage of any kind. It was recycled entirely from a completely different, much older post, one that had actually first appeared online back in June of 2025, more than 8 months before this war even began, during an entirely separate and unrelated conflict sometimes referred to as the 12-day war between Iran and Israel. The footage itself appeared to have originated from the military simulation video game Arma 3, meaning the viral clip claiming to show a burning American aircraft carrier during this war was, in reality, video game footage that had already been debunked once before in a completely different conflict, simply recycled, recaptioned, and redeployed as though it were fresh, current evidence of a real strike. That kind of recycled, AI-adjacent misinformation became something of a recurring feature throughout this entire propaganda campaign around the Lincoln specifically, and it's worth understanding why that matters beyond just this one specific video. Fact-checking organizations tracking conflict-related misinformation throughout this war noted a genuine surge in AI-generated and digitally altered clips tied directly to the conflict, describing the confusion around claims like the supposed Lincoln sinking as part of a much broader pattern of manipulated content flooding social media the moment real fighting broke out. Separate investigations into other viral videos claiming to show the Lincoln on fire traced them back to entirely AI-generated content with no connection to any real footage whatsoever, meaning that by the time you account for both the recycled Arma 3 footage and the fully AI-generated clips circulating in parallel, there wasn't a single piece of visual evidence supporting Iran's repeated claims that ever actually held up under any independent scrutiny at all. There's a specific detail about that recycled video worth appreciating too, because it illustrates just how easily this kind of content can hop between completely unrelated conflicts. The original clip had been used once already, back in mid-2025, to make almost the exact same false claim during a shorter, separate conflict between Iran and Israel, meaning whoever repurposed it for this new war either genuinely believed it was authentic footage of an entirely different incident, or more likely, understood exactly how effective that same visual had already proven at generating outrage and engagement the first time around and simply redeployed it, betting that most viewers encountering it fresh wouldn't recognize video game footage they'd never seen debunked the first time it circulated. That kind of content recycling has become a genuinely common feature of modern conflict misinformation, old footage stripped of its original context and repackaged with new captions specific to whatever war happens to be dominating headlines at that particular moment. The claims kept coming anyway. On March 14th, in a televised interview, Iranian Army spokesperson Abolfazl Shakarchi stated that Iran had inflicted what he called significant damage on the carrier, putting it out of operational service entirely and forcing it to withdraw from its position in the Sea of Oman. He provided no evidence to support that claim. CENTCOM's response was direct, and by this point in the war, almost weary in its repetition, posting plainly that the Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group continued to dominate Iranian airspace from the sea, a statement that wasn't just denying damage to the ship, it was actively confirming the carrier remained fully operational and actively conducting combat operations at the exact moment Iran was telling its own public it had been forced into retreat. Then, on March 25th, Iran's military tried yet again, claiming this time that shore-launched cruise missiles had successfully struck the Lincoln. Within hours, American officials pushed back once more, stating the carrier remained fully operational and had continued launching combat sorties against Iranian targets throughout the entire period. Iran claimed it had been disabled. Add all of that up, and you get a genuinely remarkable pattern across roughly a month of fighting. At least 5 distinct, separately worded Iranian claims about striking, disabling, or sinking the USS Abraham Lincoln, using at least 3 different claimed methods, ballistic missiles, naval drones, and shore-launched cruise missiles, every single one of them denied immediately and specifically by American Central Command, and not one of them ever supported by a single piece of verified, independent evidence, whether that evidence came in the form of satellite imagery, third-party confirmation, or even a single credible photograph. That's not simply the fog of war producing conflicting reports from two sides of an active conflict. That's a sustained, repeated, and repeatedly discredited propaganda campaign, one that continued running for weeks, even after each individual version of the claim had already been thoroughly debunked. So let's actually answer the question the title poses directly, because there's a genuinely important and somewhat ironic answer buried underneath all of that repeated Iranian messaging. What actually happened to naval power during the opening phase of this war wasn't the sinking of an American carrier. It was the systematic, confirmed destruction of a meaningful chunk of Iran's own navy. The Shahid Bagheri, struck twice within its first week of real wartime service, represented the loss of Iran's single most significant investment in sea-based drone warfare, a vessel specifically built to extend Iranian strike and surveillance capability far beyond its own coastline, reduced to a burning wreck before it had even completed a month of active combat deployment. And that wasn't an isolated incident either. CENTCOM reported that American forces had sunk 11 separate Iranian naval vessels in the Gulf of Oman during the early phase of Operation Epic Fury alone, part of a deliberate, sustained campaign explicitly aimed at degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial and military shipping throughout the region. There's an even more historically significant naval event that happened during this exact same period, one that received real, substantive news coverage precisely because, unlike the Lincoln claims, it was entirely real and independently verifiable. The Iranian frigate IRIS Dana, a Mauj-class vessel that had recently participated in a major multinational naval exercise hosted by India, was torpedoed and sunk by the American submarine USS Charlotte in the Indian Ocean. The engagement killed 104 Iranian sailors, with 20 of those remains never recovered, while 32 crew members were rescued, casualty figures that dwarf anything Iran ever managed to inflict on the American carrier it kept insisting had been struck. Defense Secretary Hegseth described it at a Pentagon briefing as the first such submarine torpedo attack on an enemy vessel since World War II, and independent historical accounts of the engagement went even further, noting that it represented the only instance since the Pacific War of an American Navy submarine sinking a surface vessel using torpedoes, and more broadly, the first sinking of an enemy surface ship by any nuclear-powered submarine since the Royal Navy's HMS Conqueror sank the ARA General Belgrano during the Falklands War back in 1982, a genuinely significant, verified historical marker for a single naval engagement, one that stands in stark contrast to everything Iran was simultaneously claiming about its own supposed victories at sea. That historical framing deserves a moment of its own context, because it helps explain exactly why military historians and defense analysts treated the Dana's sinking as such a genuinely notable event, rather than just another casualty report from an active war. Submarine warfare against surface vessels using torpedoes had become almost a relic of an earlier era of naval combat by the time this war broke out, largely replaced in modern doctrine by long-range missiles, airstrikes, and drone warfare as the preferred methods of striking enemy shipping. A modern nuclear-powered attack submarine successfully stalking and torpedoing an enemy frigate in open water is the kind of engagement that harkens back to the submarine campaigns of the Second World War's Pacific Theater, when American submarines systematically dismantled Japanese shipping lane by shipping lane. Seeing that exact style of engagement return to actual combat use in 2026 against a real warship with a real crew, rather than remaining purely a historical curiosity from 80 years earlier, underscores just how significant and how violent this particular naval campaign against Iran actually became, even as Iran's own public messaging worked overtime to convince the world that the opposite side was the one suffering catastrophic losses. It's worth sitting with just how stark that contrast actually is, because it tells you something important about how propaganda functions during an active, ongoing war, particularly for a side that's suffering genuine, confirmed, and repeated losses. Iran's leadership had every reason to want its own domestic population, and the broader region watching this conflict unfold, to believe the war was going far better for Iran than the actual battlefield evidence supported. A drone carrier burning twice in 1 week, a frigate torpedoed with over 100 sailors killed, and 11 additional vessels sunk in the war's opening phase alone. None of that is the kind of news a government fighting for its own survival wants, dominating the headlines inside its own country, particularly when that same government is simultaneously trying to convince its citizens the war remains winnable. Claiming instead to have struck America's most powerful and symbolically resonant warship in the region, repeatedly, using whatever method seemed most plausible at each specific moment, offered an obvious alternative narrative, one that could be repeated across state media amplified through sympathetic social media accounts and reinforced with recycled or AI-generated footage whenever real evidence simply didn't exist to support it. There's a broader lesson here about how modern warfare gets fought simultaneously on two entirely separate fronts: the actual physical battlefield, where ships either get hit or they don't, where footage either shows real damage or it doesn't, and the much murkier information battlefield, where claims can be manufactured, recycled, and redeployed far faster than they can ever be fully debunked for every single audience that encounters them. By the time fact-checkers had thoroughly traced that viral March 8th video back to 8-month-old Arma 3 game footage, it had already been viewed well over 100,000 times and shared by thousands of accounts, almost certainly reaching a huge number of people who never saw the debunking that followed days later. That's the genuine danger of this kind of sustained information campaign. It doesn't need to survive scrutiny indefinitely to be effective. It just needs to spread fast enough and wide enough before that scrutiny actually catches up with it. And Iran's military and state media apparatus demonstrated throughout this entire episode that they understood that dynamic extremely well, even while losing the actual physical confrontation at sea in increasingly dramatic and well-documented fashion. It's also worth giving real credit to how consistently and specifically American Central Command chose to respond to each individual claim, because that pattern of immediate, detailed rebuttal actually mattered for how quickly each version of the story could be checked against reality. Rather than issuing a single vague denial and moving on, CENTCOM specifically named the actual vessel that had been hit each time Iran claimed to have struck the Lincoln, walked through exactly what had and hadn't happened, and in the case of the Shahid Bagheri specifically, backed up its own statements with actual released footage rather than simply asking the public to take its word for it. That kind of specific, evidence-backed rebuttal doesn't guarantee that a false claim won't still spread widely, as the Arma 3 video proved beyond doubt, but it does mean that anyone actually trying to verify what happened had a genuine, detailed, and ultimately accurate record to check the Iranian claims against every single time. That kind of consistent, well-documented rebuttal record also matters, for a reason that goes beyond just this specific war. Once an institution establishes a clear pattern of naming exact vessels, providing specific footage, and standing by consistent, verifiable statements across repeated incidents, it builds a kind of credibility bank that pays off precisely in moments like this one, when a hostile information campaign is actively trying to muddy the waters. If CENTCOM's statements throughout this war had been vaguer, less specific, or inconsistent with each other, Iran's repeated claims about the Lincoln would have had a much easier time gaining traction, because there would have been no clear, trustworthy baseline for independent observers to check them against. The fact that CENTCOM's account held up consistently, strike after strike, claim after claim, is itself part of why the Iranian propaganda campaign around the Lincoln specifically failed to gain lasting traction beyond its initial viral spread. So where does this leave the broader picture of how this war's early naval phase actually unfolded, once you strip away the repeated, debunked claims about the Abraham Lincoln and look purely at what's actually confirmed? The real story is one of a rapid, sustained, and highly effective American and Allied campaign to systematically dismantle Iran's naval capability in the war's opening weeks, striking its most significant drone carrier, not once, but twice, sinking a frigate in a genuinely historic submarine engagement that cost over 100 Iranian sailors their lives, and destroying 11 total vessels in the Gulf of Oman during just the initial phase of the broader campaign. None of that required Iran's cooperation or acknowledgement to be true. It was independently confirmed through released footage, official statements, and, in the case of the Dana, through Sri Lankan authorities who rescued survivors and recovered bodies from the water. Iran's parallel campaign of claims about the Lincoln, by contrast, required exactly the opposite: a sustained effort to manufacture a story that had no basis in any verifiable evidence whatsoever, sustained specifically because the real, confirmed story running underneath it was so consistently, repeatedly bad for Iran's own navy. What makes this entire episode worth understanding in this much detail, rather than just registering it as one more example of wartime propaganda, is that it's a genuinely clear illustration of exactly how disinformation functions when a losing side needs to control its own domestic narrative during an active, ongoing conflict. It's rarely a single dramatic lie. It's a sustained, adaptive campaign, adjusting the specific method of attack claimed each time the previous version gets debunked, recycling old footage from entirely unrelated conflicts when no real evidence exists, and repeating the core claim often enough that at least some portion of the audience never actually encounters the correction. Understanding that pattern matters for a lot more than just this one specific war, because it's very likely the exact same playbook will show up again the next time a country facing serious, confirmed military losses needs a more flattering story to tell its own people. There's a final, sobering point worth making about why this pattern deserves attention well beyond just satisfying curiosity about who actually won a specific naval skirmish. Wars fought partly through propaganda rather than purely through weapons carry real consequences for how populations on both sides understand the actual human cost of the conflict they're living through. Every time Iranian state media redirected attention toward a fabricated carrier strike, it also, whether intentionally or not, diverted attention away from the very real deaths of the sailors aboard the Shahid Bagheri and the IRIS Dana, people whose actual sacrifice got buried underneath a steady stream of claims about a battle that never happened. That's arguably the most consequential outcome of this entire episode, not simply that a false story about an American carrier got told and retold, but that the true, verified story of Iran's own naval losses, and the real people who died in them, struggled to get the same level of attention and acknowledgement precisely because a more flattering, entirely fictional alternative kept crowding it out of the conversation. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Do you think Iran's repeated claims about striking the Abraham Lincoln were primarily aimed at its own domestic population, trying to maintain morale and public support for a war that was clearly going badly on the actual naval front? Or do you think the target audience was broader, aimed at the wider region? And international observers who might not follow the detailed rebuttals as closely as they followed the initial dramatic claims? And given how quickly and specifically CENTCOM was able to debunk each individual version of this story, do you think that kind of rapid, evidence-backed rebuttal genuinely limited the damage these false claims could do? Or do you think the sheer volume and repetition of the claims meant a meaningful number of people walked away believing at least one version of them, regardless of how thoroughly it was eventually debunked? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear how people are weighing the actual effectiveness of this kind of wartime disinformation campaign, because there's a real substantive argument on more than one side of it, and it's a question that matters well beyond just this single war. If this breakdown helped you separate what actually happened at sea during this war from what Iranian state media wanted people to believe happened, share it with someone trying to follow the naval side of this conflict accurately. And subscribe if you want to keep tracking this as it develops, because between the real, ongoing naval campaign and whatever new claims Iranian media puts out next, this specific story is clearly far from over. And the pattern established here is very likely to repeat itself in some form the next time this war produces another lopsided naval engagement. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back the moment there's real movement to report.